I'm excited to say that this comes to you from the Perpich Center for Arts Education in Golden Valley. We're a state agency, and you might be more familiar with the Arts High School, which is one component. This is the Professional Development and Resource Programs group, and we are so glad to host this and be part of the learning ourselves. So again, thank you so much for being here. Our guest probably needs no introduction to you, but Dr. Anton Treuer is Professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University and author of many books, as I'm sure you all know. His equity, education, cultural work has put him on a path of service around the nation and the world. And we're so glad for him to be with us this afternoon. I'm going to just go right ahead and turn the microphone. I'll turn mine off and you go ahead and start there. And we're very much looking forward to our session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Wendy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm excited for the conversation we'll have today. Koe niwi Ojibwe, mietago wa windamunugug, migwe chuendaman, and enemiguan bajayan, wagosh indigu, minawa migazi, and do dame. My native name is Wagosh, that means fox, and I'm from the Eagle clan. Of course, in the Ojibwe culture, we have a clan system where there are animals, birds, or fish that double as a symbol for your family and a spiritual guide of sorts. So I'm from the Eagle clan. My family comes from Leech Lake, and I am excited for our conversation. I'm really pumped about Where Wolves Don't Die, the new book we'll be talking about today. And it's, off to a great start. I'll do a little bit of talking head just to kind of tell you what we were thinking about when I was getting going on this book, some of the ideas and themes that it might speak to, and then we'll hold a substantial amount of the time to field your questions. So Where Wolves Don't Die is the story of a 15-year-old native kid named Ezra Cloud. He's kind of looking for clues to a murder, but finding himself in the process. So it's a bit of a hybrid young adult novel. It is both a thriller, but also kind of a tender coming of age story. It begins in Northeast Minneapolis, where he's going to school. Both of his parents had jobs in the Twin Cities Metro. And as the altercation ensues early in the book, he finds himself kind of a suspect in this murder investigation. His family kind of believing his innocence, but also trying to protect him, not just from the city, but from himself, sends him first to their reservation of origin, which is across the border in Ontario, Nigigusaminakaning First Nation, and then from there to run a trap line with his grandfather in the Canadian wilderness. And so as the story unfolds, it's both a whodunit along the way, but it's also a story about Ezra dealing with both the historical and contemporary injustices, navigating the system, finding himself, and wrestling with who am I. It was a lot of fun for me to write this. I'm not sure how much those of you joining us today know about me and my background, but we have a very large family. So we have 9 children, his, theirs, and somebody else's kids, and it is never dull. And we now are at the point where we have 6 of our kids out the door, 3 to go. We're starting in the grandchild business. And over the past several years, both of my parents had passed away, and I found myself kind of being the family patriarch, so to speak, but also thinking a lot about children, as a lot of ours have been going through the teenager and launch process. I've been thinking about parenthood. And then I've also been thinking about something else I've been doing a lot throughout my career, which is working with our elders. And I've initially started recording, translating, transcribing a lot of our great Ojibwe speakers to document and preserve their language and stories and things like that, and done lots of language work and also ceremony and cultural work. And so what you'll find when you get a chance to dig into the book is that there are lots of young people, and there's some really powerful elder characters. And it's kind of thinking about, the intergenerational transmission of culture, community. I think, it is native lit. And at the same time, it's just literature. And it speaks to our shared human experiences. I think all of us humans wrestle with the desire for freedom and also the desire for connection and belonging. And sometimes there's a little bit of a trade-off, right? The connection you get in a marriage inhibits your freedoms in certain ways, but it liberates you in others. I think, watching my children, they crave, that transition to greater freedom and independence, but also then look back and start thinking about, where did I come from and how do I maintain belonging? And those are things all of us humans wrestle with, regardless of our race, culture, and so forth. But I'm trying to do a number of things with this work. And I think, I just trust the reader to see them. But it's textured and layered. One of the things I've had kind of a lifelong both fascination and frustration with native lit. And until about 30 years ago, most of the literature about native people was written by non-native people who hadn't even talked to us or spent time in one of our places. It was kind of like the white man's Indian. It was an imagining of the native experience, and some of it better than others, but all of it kind of often lacking authenticity. And then in more recent years, we've had a lot of exciting work. And of course, Perpich has done a lot to bring a lot of great authors to you, among other places, to think about, and see and meet some of the people creating great literature. Louise Erdrich famously won a Pulitzer Prize for her contributions in the field. And there have been quite a few, and pretty good representation from some of the Minnesota Indigenous folks, on this emerging and growing list. But even that work, I do feel like it's growing, but we still got plenty of room to grow, because even a lot of the native authored native lit has still kind of focused on trauma and tragedy, or has characters who lament the culture they never had because residential boarding schools and things like that. And I do think this is one dimension of some native experiences, but it's by no means the totality of that. We are more than the sum of our tragedies. And I always found it hard to find things that truly resonated, because I speak Ojibwe. I had, throughout my childhood, we've actually harvested maple syrup every single year of my life through my entire life, and done it with all of my children and my grandchildren. And there's cultural continuity there too. And we do a lot of hunting. And every year we have our family out. I have been through, and all of my kids have had, like, their first successful harvest celebrations and things like that. And so I wanted to, instead of like just focus on the trauma and tragedy and how awful things are, I wanted to give people a window into the beautiful, living, vibrant native culture that is still there, and not do an imagining of those things. I wanted to provide a window into what more like what I've seen and experienced. Of course, it's fiction too, so it was liberating for me, to develop a story with an arc that maintains, tension, and connects people to the characters in the story, and to show characters who are shifting, changing, and evolving. And I think, I wanted to provide something that was a little more textured and nuanced. Like, most of the literature out there is either an urban native experience where people don't have their culture, or reference to a reservation one where everybody knows their culture. And in my experience, you can be lost anywhere, and you can find yourself anywhere. You can have a beautiful, rich cultural life anywhere. And you can be desperately searching for those things anywhere. And so I think through Ezra's, journey, you get to see the interconnectedness of those different kinds of experiences. He has an urban experience. He has a res one. He goes out in the woods, and so it provides different perspectives. The main kids in the story, Ezra, Nora, who's the same age, and Matt, have each had different kinds of experiences with loss that they have metabolized in different ways. So without being prescriptive about healthy and unhealthy ways to deal with grief or something like that, there's just a story that invites the reader to share and compare and think about those things. And also, I think a lot of young adult literature usually just focus on the kids and their relations with each other in a school drama or something like that. But I also wanted to show the intergenerational stuff in a way that was real and relevant and relatable. And I think I pulled it off. The greatest test for me, because my youngest children are ages 12, 14, and 16, I thought, I'm just going to read this to them. And if they go get lost in their phones or start hunting for snacks or just walk away, I'll know it was a flop. So because there definitely would be my harshest critics. So I started reading it to them, and I was just so excited by their response. As the story starts picking up, especially, they're like, who do you think did it? Could it be this? Could it be that? And there's also like a little bit of a love interest that Ezra has in the story, and they're like, oh, do you think she's ever going to see him? And so they seemed engaged with the different parts of the story, and they were laughing at Grandpa Liam. He's the grandfather character, who is really one of the funnest to write for me. Um, and so it was landing and working. And I took to heart anything that they commented on. I also had one of my college students, my son, driving me around to events in the winter, and I was reading him the work, and he was giving me some great comments too. So I, took that all to heart. So that's some of what I was thinking about as I embarked on the journey. Let's turn native lit on its head. Let's talk about and think about, what healing could look like. If you think about like the history that Native people have been through over the past 500 years, oh man, there's enough there to make you mad for the next 500 years. And you'd have every reason. But of course, if we get lost in our righteous anger, that's just going to eat us up like a cancer. But it's not enough to say, don't be angry. We actually have to go through metabolizing that and finding ways to put it into perspective. And so while the work is unflinching, it does deal with the things. I think it does point us towards new perspective on that history. And then there's one other, big thing I was really hoping to do with the work, which is, over the past few decades, we've been getting a little better at holding up more female authored work, and it's about dang time. We are starting to get better at holding up some of the work by people from different gender identities, and it's about dang time. All of this is like evolving rather than thoroughly evolved, and we need much more work and much more effort to both, create these works and center them. And I think we've also started to do a little better at identifying like toxic masculinity and what the problems are with how we have often messaged boys about what manhood looks like. But something we have not done very well, and certainly not enough of, is just provide an example of what healthy masculinity could look like. What would it look like for a teenage boy coming into manhood? What would it look like for him to become a man, dealing with the things, with stress, with tension, with being misunderstood, with searching for freedom, and also craving belonging? What would it look like for that to happen in an authentic cultural context with an eye towards healthy adulthood and healing. And I think it says something pretty profound about that. For me, the work was both personal and professional. I spoke to some of the professional things, but of course, I did mention too that I, been thinking about my role as a father and now grandfather. I knew what it was like when I was a kid, where I had the books that I just found myself thinking, dear God, please let this conversation end and let me get out of this room. And I had the books where I was so engrossed, I had to stick them inside my chemistry textbook and secretly read them instead of doing whatever I was supposed to be doing. And so I was thinking about those. How can we provide this experience for young people? And of course, it's really for everybody. Like even Harry Potter is young adult, but it's for all of us. So those are some of the things I was thinking about as I was embarking on the writing. And if you like, I can read maybe a couple sections just to give you a taste, and then we'll start taking some questions. So maybe I'll give you a little bit on, a taste of some of the different things that pops up, because the work both has lots of action, and it's a thriller. I'll give you a couple action sequences, and maybe I'll give you a little hint of some of the other things that are going on in this kind of coming of age story too. I'll start with the first section here, just to give you a sense for Ezra's starting point. And so here we go. I hated the snow in northeast Minneapolis. It looked pretty when it was falling from the sky, sometimes in large, gentle flakes that made you want to stick out your tongue and catch them, and sometimes whipping in harsh winds across the plains and into the city, where the houses and stores and police station couldn't shield you. But the problem with the snow in northeast Minneapolis wasn't the snow. It was northeast Minneapolis. When the snow was falling from the sky, humans hadn't been able to taint it yet, but once it hit the ground, it started to melt and turn to slush and refreeze and change to ice. It made you slip and slide and forced you to walk differently, more carefully than you should have to. People spilled coffee in the snow, the dogs pooped and peed, exhaust from the cars turned it gray. It never stayed pretty for long in Northeast. There was only one thing that I really liked about where we lived: sitting in my 9th grade biology class with Mr. Lucas next to Nora George. Nora was like the snow still falling from the sky. Sometimes she glided gently into the room and settled in her chair with the grace of a Canadian lynx prowling for snowshoe hares. And sometimes she blew in fast and unpredictable, bumping into my desk or dropping her notebook. She had dark brown skin and long, shiny black hair that fell all the way to her waist. She might have seemed shy to others, but I had seen her at powwows with a tight red jingle dress and her eagle fan, beaming smiles as she bounced to the beat of the drum, raising her fan and her long, slender fingers for the honor beats. She could light up any room in a heartbeat. So there's a little hint at Ezra's discomfort in the city, but also the emerging love interest. I got time to do maybe a couple sections here, so I'll give you one. This is kind of a dream sequence, still very early in the book, where Ezra's in the city. The altercation is kind of happened, but Ezra's just trying to digest all of that when has this dream. I had a powerful dream that night. In my dream, I was running with a pack of wild timber wolves. I was howling like they were, and we were chasing something. I was in my own body, but had all the senses of a wolf. I could smell the damp sphagnum moss, the earthy spores of the mushrooms, the piney scent of the black spruce, and also the scent of the animals: white-tailed deer, the vapor trail from their tarsal glands penetrating my nasal cavity and filling me with energy and hunger. I felt so alive, so powerful. And then the scene switched, and we were hunting in the city. Now the smell of diluted urine in the streets, car exhaust, and dogs covered the ground, and the scent of human pheromones filled the air, acrid and intrusive. But instead of chasing deer, now we were chasing Matt Schroeder through the alleys and streets, his skin pallid and greasy in the streetlight, with a look of fear so palpable we could smell it. Our pack chased him into a dilapidated house in northeast Minneapolis, then circled his refuge. My heart was racing, knowing he'd finally get his lesson. We covered all the doors and windows. I reached into my pocket for a lighter and lit a torch, tossing it in the front door and slamming it shut. I stood back and watched as the fire slowly spread, and then muffled screams erupted inside. The blaze caught the drapes and licked along the ceiling. Dark smoke started to billow out from the edges of the doors and roof vents, but the screams eventually died, and the inferno raged larger until the heat burst the windows and engulfed the house in flames. I watched with the pack in satisfied silence until we heard the police and fire crews start to come down. Then we trotted away, and suddenly we're back in the forest, lying down among the trees. All right. So maybe I'll give you a section flashing forward until we're on the res now. And Grandpa Liam, is really a central character in the work, and Grandma Emma, Ezra's grandparents. And there's a lot, that has kind of happened in the interactions between them prior to this section, but this will mainly be to give you a little taste of Grandpa and Grandma and some of the interactions between them. Christmas was just another chore day for Grandpa Liam. We never had a Christmas tree or presents like so many of the other kids in Canada and America, but I never felt like I was missing out. Grandma Emma fried venison loins and laid them across a salad of mixed greens and vegetables. We watched Dance Me Outside again, or perhaps I should say, we watched Grandpa Liam watch Dance Me Outside again. There's a scene in the movie when the young Native men are trying to distract a white man with made-up Native ceremonies, including telling him to choose his own spirit guide. The white guy stands up and screams, "Wolverine!" Grandpa Liam laughed so hard he could hardly catch his breath, slapping his knees and sending Buster into a frenzy. Even my dad was laughing too, and it was a sight because he'd been so stressed. His big shoulders heaved and his voice broke from a baritone timbre to a high-pitched howl as he watched Grandpa Liam and Buster make a scene, drowning out the sound of the television with their hoots, howls, and giggles. Even Grandma Emma couldn't hold it in. I tried to stifle my own chuckle, determined not to let my dad see me enjoy myself, but Grandpa's laughter was contagious. I knew I had presents for Christmas, just not the kind that come in boxes. All right. You want me to do one or two more? Okay, I got thumbs up. So, they kind of go from northeast Minneapolis to the reservation, then out into the wilderness. And there's a section when Grandpa Liam is showing, Ezra, this section of the trap line. And prior to the start of the book, Ezra had a loss. His mother had passed away prior to the start of the book. So he's also wrestling with grief and loss, and sometimes he's redirecting his hurt as anger towards his father and hasn't found a way to just find his way through that. So when they go out there, this pops up just a little bit. The North Loop was even more beautiful than the South. There was a much larger lake here, and the North Loop circled the entire lake. The far side of the lake had a huge cliff with white pine, jack pine, balsam, and spruce covering the top, except for a ridge jutting out by the lake on the highest point of land. When we approached the lake, Grandpa Liam pulled the Scandic up by the shore and shut off the engine. "Come here, Ezra." The edges of Grandpa Liam's wrinkles caught in the sunlight, making the furrows seem even darker by contrast. He held his chin high as he gestured at the landscape with his mittened hands. "We call this lake Manidukan. That means the place of spirits. This lake is 4 kilometers across and 6 kilometers long. It's at the highest elevation in the entire watershed, closest to the sky. There really are spirits here, deep in the water, high in the sky, in the woods, all around us. On clear nights, the northern lights dance in the sky here. In our way, we see the northern lights as the souls of our ancestors. They dance with one another. There's no light pollution from cities and towns and houses here. It's the closest we can get to touching them. He cleared his throat and looked at me. You see, Ezra, when someone dies, they don't really die. It's just the body that dies and goes back to Mother Earth. The spirit is forever. So we never die, we just change worlds. And this place is where the two worlds meet, the world of the living and the world of the dead. There is nothing to be afraid of where the two worlds meet. Our dead relatives love us as much as we love them. They would never hurt us. Grandpa, have you ever seen someone after they changed worlds? Is that even possible? He gave me a long, earnest look and turned his gaze back to the lake and shoreline. I have dreamed of people who changed worlds, vivid dreams, but seeing them like we see each other today, that probably won't happen until I change worlds myself. I can't even dream about my mom. What if I forget what she looks like? I looked down, feigning interest in my boots. He put a mittened hand on the back of my neck. You will dream of her again, and you'll never forget. All right. So, since there's so much action in this story, I better give you something of that. I'll give you one of those and then we'll turn it over to questions. All right. There are 13 lunar cycles each year, and the Ojibwe calendar marks all 13 cycles rather than the 12 months of the Gregorian calendar much of the world uses today. March holds the intersection of two cycles that start the transition to spring, our season of new life and renewal. The Ojibwe lunar cycles that intersect in March are Bebukwagame Gizis and Onabini Gizis. By the way, there's a little bit of Ojibwe in the book. I wanted to use, I didn't want to use a lot just to be performative. Look how authentic we are using Ojibwe. But I wanted to, when it would add to our understanding of things, not shy away from including that. And then there's a glossary in the back with all the translations and stuff. But it, for the most part, should flow right through, and you've got the reference points if you want them. Bebukwagame Gizis is the broken snowshoe moon, and Onabini Gizis is the crusted snow moon. These are the moons when the snow starts to melt and then freeze. It's also one of the snowiest times of the year. Some people call the last one on Dago Gizis because the crows mark the beginning of the great bird migrations back to the Northland. When those lunar cycles ended, Grandpa Liam always pulled traps. With the weather starting to warm up a little, the animals moved around more. That made it prime time for trapping. By the end of the season, some of the creeks and rivers had more open spots, and the muskrats had predictable places and paths. Grandpa Liam was thrilled with our success this year. Grandpa Liam and I were in sync with every aspect of our trapping routine. Every other weekend, Grandma Emma or my dad would drive to the logging skid zone, and we'd haul our hides to the truck with the Scandic, that's a snow machine, so they could be piled up in Grandpa's porch on the res. When we'd started the trapping season, I wanted nothing more than to be out in the woods as much as possible. But now I liked the weekend trips back to the res. I had service for my smartphone, and Nora really liked to text. Ruth and Nora even came back to Red Gut one weekend. Ruth was trying to get Nora breaks from Northeast when she could. Nora came to Grandpa Liam and Grandma Emma's for movies one night. We watched more Reservation Dogs, and she giggled nonstop at Buster and Grandpa Liam's television antics. Buster, by the way, is like a 7-pound family dog mutt. For our last trip to Chiefs Ridge, Grandpa Liam and I got to the cabin right at sunset. We planned a couple more weeks trapping before we pulled our sets and closed up for the season. In the fading golden light, we could see footprints all over the yard, in front of the cabin, and up to the shed. They were smaller than a wolf, fox, or coyote, but I couldn't be sure what they were. Grandpa Liam gestured with his mitten. Ezra, they're fisher tracks all over. They must be scavenging. So you know what a fisher is? It's the largest animal in the weasel family, and they're actually pretty big. They get up to 15 pounds, and they're about the size of an otter, kind of long and skinny, but with bushy tails and kind of thick fur. They're also pretty ferocious creatures. All right. I bet there's enough residual scent from our previous kills in the shed to keep them poking around. We'll have to be extra careful with our food and hide caching. And we should set a couple sets right on the wall of the shed itself. If they get brave enough to come raiding, we'll be ready. You make the sets. I nodded and brought our supplies in the cabin. Then I spent 30 minutes tacking up fisher sets. I had to finish up with a flashlight in the fading light. I noticed a strong odor coming from the shed, acrid and penetrating. It smelled kind of like skunk, but distinct and oddly stronger. When I came in, Grandpa Liam was working on supper over the drawlet in his suspenders and dickies. Drawlet is just a type of wood-burning stove that you can both cook on and heat with. What's that weird smell in the shed? Did you notice it? He laughed. Ask those fishers. They have one of the strongest scent glands in the entire forest. They must have been spraying around in the shed. Once they spray something down, no other predator will touch it. That's how they protect their kills from wolves and bears. Since we were just back from the res, Grandpa Liam had fresh pork chops and potatoes for supper. It was a quick pleasure to finish that off. I read Tracks by Louise Erdrich for a while. The tales of Eli and Nectar somehow reminded me of Grandpa Liam. In the morning, I woke first for a change, eager to check my fisher sets. I stoked the coals in the drawlet, added a couple logs, then slipped on my muck boots and a jacket and went outside. The first hints of dawn were in the sky, but it was still pretty dark and the overcast sky blunted the first light. But I could see a dark shape where I made the first fisher set on the side of the shed. I strode up quickly, excited at the prospect of a successful kill. Then came a blood-curdling scream from the shed. There is no way to properly describe that sound. It was supernatural, like the worst witch sound in The Conjuring or the Blair Witch Project, only louder. I whipped around faster than a lynx on a snowshoe hare and bolted for the cabin, casting one terrified glance over my shoulder just in time to see a large fisher charging straight at me. An adult fisher can easily weigh 15 pounds, but they grow to 3 feet in length and look much larger in their winter fur, especially when they charge you before you even had a chance to pee first thing in the morning. His first bite caught my jacket on the back before I could get to the cabin door. I could feel him pulling and shaking his head, hissing through clenched teeth. The animal was utterly fearless. The cabin door sprang open, and Grandpa Liam whirled around me in long johns and bare feet with the push broom, Buster close behind, yipping and growling. "Drop the coat, boy!" I unzipped and dropped my coat, turning to face the snarling furry menace attacking it. Grandpa Liam shouted again, "Grab the axe! Hit him with the blunt end!" "Shouldn't I get the 22? "No! You'll be more likely to shoot one of us or Buster. He's too fast to get a decent shot anyways." The fisher lunged at Grandpa Liam now, snapping the broom handle in his teeth. I had no idea something that size could be so powerful. The axe was next to the cabin door, so I seized it and clenched it in both hands, looking for an opportunity. The fisher seemed focused on Grandpa Liam now, and Buster by his side. I swung once, furtively, out of fear that I might hit Buster. Then I slowed down and watched the pattern of his attack. Feint, hiss, lunge, retreat, repeat. I hoisted the axe above my head and swung hard on his retreat, catching him right on the back of the head. The fisher dropped in the snow. "Stand on his chest, Ez!" Grandpa Liam was breathing hard now, but smiling wide. "Make sure he's not just stunned. Stand on his chest for 3 whole minutes." I did what I was told. When it was over, Grandpa Liam walked up and gave me a hard clap on the shoulder. "There are easier ways to catch a fisher, but I'm glad you're on my side." I smiled and breathed a sigh of relief. "Why did you tell me to hit him with the blunt end? An adult fisher's worth $120. There was no need to ruin the hide." I'm sure the look on my face was completely incredulous. "What? I knew you'd get him." We stood there looking at each other for a moment, Grandpa Liam amused and me still in shock. "Look," Grandpa Liam said, motioning back to the shed. There was another fisher already dead in my trap. He turned and strode through the snow back into the cabin, still in long johns and bare feet, but hollering over his shoulder, "We're off to a great start today." All right. So we've got time for some questions. You are welcome to drop those in the chat. And, 56 people, we can probably unmute and do some of that too. I think it should be manageable enough. Let me see what we've got here. All right, so Elizabeth, I can see a question here, some references to historical references and so forth. Do you have resources for teaching that history to provide context to students in the classroom? Yeah, so, very intentionally, this is a modern contemporary story. It's set in our present time. Because I think, even 87% of educational standards that mention Native people are stories from before 1900 and reinforce the idea that we're something that happened in the past. So I wanted to, disrupt that. But at the same time, we are not, ahistorical. And so there are a few references to different things. For building out, like if you're a teacher and you want to build context around those, it's pretty easy, to get some decent references. For starters, I mean, even something like, I hate to point out Wikipedia, I'll give you the basic background, you can't put full trust in that or use that for your lesson plan, but it's a start. There are books, that have been published that'll give you some background, even everything you wanted to know about Indians, but were afraid to ask that I did. There are other works that, Lies My Teacher Told Me and others that kind of do a good job unpacking some of those. And many, many others too, especially the few really historical references that are in there are pretty easy to find and provide some context for. And like so many things, we have multiple perspectives on these things. So it's a great opportunity just to bring those different perspectives in. None of us see the world the way it is. We all see it the way we are. All right. Renell's got a comment here, more of a comment than a question. The story had such great visual qualities. That and the pacing, oh, it keeps jumping on me. Here we go. Reminded me a lot of The Outsiders, which had great appeal with my students. Where Wolves Don't Die would make a great movie. I really appreciated the family storytelling throughout, especially from Grandpa Liam. That narration was very effective in the novel and so valuable in real life. Well, Renell, thank you very much for the great comment. I really hope that it resonates for everybody so far. So great, with the initial responses to the book. And we're trying, I don't know if you saw in the chat at the very beginning, we're trying to make it as easy for educators as possible. So there's a free educator guide on my website. It's pretty easy to find. So if you just go there, click resources, you'll find all the educator guides. That's free. And then they're doing a giveaway of 10,000 copies to Minnesota schools. So if you want to be on the list, they're not giving them to individual readers or other types of programs. It's just in K-12 public schools in Minnesota. So there are some limitations on that, but yeah, really excited to get that out. The Understand Native Minnesota, if you had any interactions with them previously, you're already on their mailing list. Otherwise, you can just go to their website and sign up for it and you'll catch the email blast. We did do a 10,000 copy giveaway of everything you wanted to know about Indians, but we're afraid to ask, and all copies were claimed in 30 minutes. It was just poof. So we are expecting a similar response here. Also, just as a sidebar, the Minnesota Department of Education has sponsored another giveaway of the Everything book. So there'll be another one of those coming out a little bit later in the summer. You'll see some communication around that. All right, Karen's got one. You talk about authenticity. I was totally tickled by your smiles. They're also culturally flavored. Yes, for sure. This is a difficult topic to navigate. Like, I believe in freedom. I believe in freedom of speech. I think anyone can write about anyone and anything. If we were too confining, only men could write about men, only women could write about women. We want to make space where no one's excluded and we can freely engage with all kinds of peoples and cultures and things like that. But I do think there's something on the other side of the spectrum where if somebody is not from a particular minoritized culture and they're positioning themselves as the authority on that particular culture, that's when you get, the imagined native rather than the understood one. And so that's sometimes people call that a cultural appropriation. And I think there are other issues too, where people like in the native context, who are not native have been, some of the primary financial beneficiaries of voicing native stories, and also distorting them. And, I think even if it's a work of fiction, people assimilate what they read into their worldview. That doesn't mean we believe everything we read, but it flavors it. So sometimes people will read a story and they'll be like, oh, I didn't know that's how that was. Well, that's a work of fiction. Be careful. But, I do think it's important that it's real, and one of the things, like if there are white characters in a book, in our lived experiences, whether we're white or not white, we meet lots of white people, right? So there'll be white people who are good guys in the movies and bad guys and everything in between, and complex characters who are, breaking bad or turning good. And so we see complexity and nuance and so forth. So you can even watch a show that has white characters like Psycho, and you're not like, white people run. But people will see more movies about aliens than Native Americans and have very few context and reference points. And so what they do read has a very powerful impact, for a lot of people on shaping their perspective and worldview, which is why I think it's just important to be careful about that. So while I do think we should all have freedom, to write about whoever, that we should try to center, Native voices, for speaking on Native culture or connecting people to those experiences more effectively. And I'd say the same about any minoritized group. All right. So
Anton, here's one. Can you demonstrate or explain lip pointing?
Oh, lip pointing. Yeah, so this is just like a little cultural reference, but in Ojibwe culture, it's often considered rude to, like, use a finger to point at someone. It's considered like a challenge or something. So people will usually point with their lips, like, oh, you go over there, ask her. Yeah, and so that's just a little cultural thing. So it is, like when Nora does that and Ezra's like, oh, she's cute, it's just a little minor cultural reference. That was a good one. Let's see.
Here's one we can kind of put all together. Lots of questions about Grandpa Liam. Do you actually have a Grandpa Liam, or is it a compilation of multiple people in your life?
Good question. So, this is a work of fiction. None of the characters are based on a real person. But I've done a lot of work with elders, who are hilarious, and they're like probably bits and pieces of, character traits, that have popped up in different people that I've known. I'm also surrounded by young people all the time too. So my own children, and others that I've met, maybe provide inspiration for some of the things. It's not like I used a Gen Z translator app, for developing the dialogue. By the way, there is such a thing, which I mainly use just to troll my own children for fun. But no, I mean, I feel like I'm living in that. Our family text, text group is really my children communicating by memes with no actual sentences. So, I see all that stuff, and you got a pretty good sense for sense of humor and whatnot.
Another question kind of based in the middle of one of the things. You read it to your children. Did you read it to any elders or get any elder feedback?
I did not read it out loud to the elders that I work with, but I certainly did talk to them about it, and they knew it was coming, and they were glad to hear that there's a love story between two elders that's woven into the, narrative and things like that. And I think that too is, just provides texture as well as examples of lots of different ways to navigate life. So there was one, when will the copies be posted? Oh, so you are the first ones to hear about the book giveaway today, and the first emails are going out tomorrow. So you got a sneak preview about the book giveaways. But yeah, the first announcement that there will be a giveaway, that email goes out tomorrow. And then it should be next week when they do the solicitations, you know, that you'll actually need to respond to. So yeah, just get out. You got plenty of time to get on the mailing list and look for the info when it comes out. Yeah, I should have mentioned that this is your first public info about the book giveaway. Yeah, so here's a good one too. Stephanie has, as a writer, what were the challenges shifting from nonfiction to fiction? What was it like to create character identities and plot arcs? And could you imagine your work being staged in a theater performance context? All right. So first of all, I found doing fiction really fun and liberating. I think some people don't do the transition from nonfiction to fiction that well. But I kind of feel like I've been telling stories my whole life, both growing up in a large family and the banter around the table, Ojibwe winter legends and storytelling, both as on the receiving end throughout my life, and then also doing a lot of that in our ceremony and oral traditions. And then even nonfiction is storytelling, but it is different, you know, like it's important. I wanted to have a story that sizzled right along, you know, and so that the arc would maintain engagement. So I didn't just want to have a stream of consciousness about feelings and snippets and vignettes. That's a different kind of writing. I wanted to have it take you somewhere. And also I find, you know, stories where you've got a flat character who's like the good guy, and there's a challenge because the bad guy shows up and he overcomes the bad guy and the good guy wins. Like, to me, that's boring. I'd much rather look at, you know, someone who is imperfect, dealing with the things, not always as the best version of themselves, navigating that, learning things, transforming, you know, that for me is a lot more relatable and interesting. So, you know, I did have to think a lot about the plot. I had to think a lot about each of the arcs for each of the characters, you know, and then the texture and nuance. And there even things that are like much more subtle, you know. So I wanted something that wouldn't be a, you know, where if you read it multiple times, you could get things out of it each time. So there's stuff in there that, you know, I won't give you all the spoilers. It's even hard picking out sections that won't give you too many spoilers, but that was certainly what we're trying to do. Yeah, there were challenges for sure, and there were blessings and benefits to that too. For me too, just with how I do things, I don't have a prescription for anyone else who's doing writing, but I'm an outgoing introvert, so I need alone time to go for a run or whatever. And my time away from humans like recharges my battery. Then I love people and I'm happy to engage and interact. But when have my alone time, that's when I'm often doing a lot of my work. A piece of writing is usually fairly well baked before I start writing. Because I've kind of been doing a lot of envisioning and thinking about all the things. The last chapter of the book I had very much in mind before I started to write. It wasn't like, let's see where this goes. So it was very intentional for me. I'm also not a get up at 5 and write for 2 hours before the rest of the world starts kind of person. I write a little more opportunistically. So I have to have things, you know, ready psychologically, intellectually, you know, and heart-wise too, you know, and then it tends to flow much faster for me. Yeah. So Karen's got a comment here about Ezra and Nora showing some empathy towards Matt. And I do think like each of the characters, you know, Ezra, Nora, and Matt have different ways of dealing with loss. And so they can relate to one another at the same time that they each handle it in different ways. And, you know, Matt and Ezra are dealing with a lot more anger, you know, and kind of acting out in different ways, but also on very different paths and trajectories with that. So I think it shows you something, you know, even in Ojibwe culture, one of our central figures and legends is this person named Wayne Buju, who's like half human, half spirit. So he's got a little more power, you know, like a spirit, but he's also got a personality like any of us, meaning he can be jealous, you know, make mistakes, be self-serving, which can be a dangerous combination. So he's both saving the world and messing things up all the time in all the legends. But that's really how we are as humans. We're messing things up all the time. And we're also engaged in redemptive acts and repair. And, you know, which one's going to win out? And that has to do with our intention, not just something that happens. That, you know, in my view, even something like being happy, that's not a destination we arrive at. It's a practice. We practice at being happy. Some days we get it better than others. You know, but if we're intentional about it, we're a little more likely to have more good days than not. Doesn't mean we'll win every time, no matter our intentions. Gratitude, we practice at it. And if we do it more often, the doing actually helps us become more grateful. And, you know, and so I think there's some thinking about that, you know, that pops up through the interaction of characters. Yeah, so here's one from Lori. Amazon categorizes your novel's age as group as 12 to 18. Do you have a particular grade level you'd recommend it for? You know, I really think there's quite a bit of variability when you're looking at, you know, even 8th and 9th grade readers with where they're at in reading level. My 12-year-old was all in, and like, you know, as I read it to her, and then I was asking her to read it just to see if she's stumbling on anything, vocab choices or things like that. And she was doing great, you know. You know, and then my 14-year-old is kind of like the Hermione Granger of Ojibwe country. So she was just like, you know, cruising through that thing. But every person's different. So you know, and the adults who've been reading it, you know, so far haven't been saying like, I didn't feel like this was, you know, in any way dumbed down or something like that. Like they were in. So I think it'll work really well, you know, with, you know, your 12th graders, 11th graders, 10th graders. And I think you have to make some decisions if you want to introduce at the middle school level, just with who you got in the cohort, you know. But yeah, I think it should work for everybody. And content-wise too, you know, one of the other things I found with a lot of the native authored lit is like they weren't necessarily YA. So you have to navigate like, you know, swear words and, you know, sometimes explicit sex scenes. And then it's like, oh, this is a really cool book, but I don't know if it's going to work with, you know, in a school setting, you know. And so I think this one provides something that, you know, doesn't pretend those things aren't part of life, but, you know, it is pretty approachable and usable that way. All right, so Amy's got one here. There are multiple distinct settings in the book. When writing, do you write all settings from the same physical space? Or do I move around when I'm doing different kinds of writing? Yeah, so honestly, with my writing, you know, as I mentioned, I'm an opportunistic writer. Like someone was asking me one time, like, tell me about the place of quiet tranquility where you do all your writing. And I just started laughing. It's like, we have 9 children. There is no place of quiet tranquility where any of this stuff happens. You know, I'm writing when I can and where I can. And I couldn't tell you, I could have been sitting on an airplane, you know, or I could have been, you know, at home, which, you know, especially with such a large family, I don't have my own office at home. It's like a corner of the bedroom, you know, whatever. And sometimes I'm here, like I'm in my office here. So it's a little more like that, you know, but wherever. But I will say this, like, yes, there are different settings, but these are all places where I've spent lots of time. So one of my sons is an enrolled member at Nigigusa First Nation. So we are up there, you know, with some regularity. I've been hunting up there, fishing up there. You know, so I know those woods and waters. And, you know, even the drive, you know, the descriptions of the drive from the Twin Cities, you know, up to Canada through the different topographies in Minnesota, you know, those are all places that I feel like driving is a permanent condition in my line of work. So, you know, it's easy for me to speak to those things. You know, the book is primarily set in the winter months, and that's both as a design, a metaphor, you know, in the Ojibwe culture. If you look at seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter, they also correlate to seasons in a person's life. Young people, you know, babies, young people, adults, elders, you know, and Ezra's learning about the transition from those things. Also, spring is like new life, growth, fresh starts, and it's a running metaphor through the book about shifting, changing, the connections, interconnections between the seasons and navigating through them. And also, in reading totally different types of work, like even Hatchet by Gary Paulson, which is a short but approachable work that doesn't have a whole bunch of characters. It's really this kid trying to stay alive way out in the bush, but does a great job of like transporting you into that scene. And I wanted to do that too. We live in a remarkable part of the world. Minnesota is many different remarkable parts of the world. The urban Minnesota is remarkable. Central Minnesota is remarkable. Our hardwoods, our boreal forest, and into Ontario, same thing. And so I wanted to give a taste of those things, but also it provides a way to think about the Native experience. It's not just a reservation experience, and it's not just poverty, and so I think there's plenty to interrupt those kinds of things. 70% of the self-identified Native population lives off-res. Hennepin County is one of the highest Native populations in the state of Minnesota. So, why not have those things represented in the work too? If you live in the Twin Cities, I imagine a number of you do. I mean, Northeast Minneapolis is more like being gentrified, than dilapidated houses or something, but it has been in transition. And yeah, you can even have a foodie adventure in Northeast now. So, I think it gives you a sense of that, as Ezra's going through the different places. All right. Yes, there's a comment from Karen. It'll be a good lesson for students to see they don't have to hate and hold on to anger. Yeah, I mean, obviously our country is going through a lot right now, right? Like politics, race relations, so many different layers. And oh man, there's a lot of shut up culture. There's a lot of book banning. There's all kinds of stuff going on that's really problematic. And I think, even if we are super articulate about pointing out the problems, it still doesn't help fix everything. I mean, it does help fix it, but it doesn't resolve it by itself. Whether you have a revolution or you're engaged in reform, you still have to build what comes next. And so ultimately, how do we get there? It's something I've thought about a lot. Like my grandmother went to residential boarding school. She was forbidden to speak her language and do her culture. My mother was on a reclaiming journey of her own throughout my childhood. I accelerated that, probably freaked my parents out a little bit when I graduated from college and said, I'm not taking a job, and I'm not going to go to graduate school. I'm going to hang out with my elders and walk the earth. And they're like, that is beautiful. Good luck paying for that because we're done, and I just did it anyways. But I feel like I've been questing for healing throughout my life from those things. My father's family too, which is totally different. My father was born in Vienna, Austria. He was an Austrian Jewish immigrant and survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. But we had 300 family members killed on my dad's side, and so it is enough to make you mad for the rest of your life, but even for me, like we had this experience. I took the kids back to Austria, and we're cruising around, and I was able to say, that's the Volksschule where your grandfather went to school. This is the apartment building where he lived. That was their apartment right here, and here's where they went vacationing. And the kids are like, let's jump in the lake. And then we had some friends. It's pretty interesting, but they said, pretty much everyone in Austria has at least one grandparent who was a Nazi. For us, they were a husband and wife. They said all of our grandparents were Nazis. And we had been staying with them for days. They're taking us hiking in the mountains. We loved their laugh. They're wonderful humans, And I think having that experience too, it was harder to be like Nazis and, Germans and Austrians equals bad people. And maybe it's a relief, for Germans and Austrians to know I'm not hating so bad, But the biggest relief was for me and my family not to have to carry around anger or be so easily triggered, to be able to see, you know, the beauty of the place and the language and the culture, and also still see, you know, everything the Nazis did to our family and the world. So it was healing. And I think literature can provide healing too, when we can see and humanize one another. When even as awful as Matt has been, Ezra and Nora can still see and humanize him and put it into context, even though they have to protect themselves and deal with the stuff, you know, like, so I think it provides some thought, you know, and there'll be all kinds of discussions depending on the life experiences of whoever's reading it that can help. And so there's one more question here. Any initial plans for a sequel? So what comes next is top secret, but there's definitely something coming next. I do have more fiction work I'm planning to do. I do have more nonfiction work I'm planning to do. But I usually save the energy for talking about it until I actually get it done, both because it can change and I like to, you know, have the energy go into those projects. I can see Wendy coming back on, and I'm hitting the clock. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And thank you all for showing up today and leaning into the conversation. I hope you enjoy Where Wolves Don't Die. Miigwech.